the moment there's a lot of talk about ascension, or going into a different dimension, going into a different density. So what I wanted to do today in this video is talk about my ideas on the differences between dimensions and density, but also take that to another level where I try to explain how I believe density plus dimensions plus archetype equals form or perception. So there's going to be a lot of information here. I'm not sure how well I'm going to be able to pull it all together, but I'm going to give it a bit of a go. So first of all, let's have a look at dimensions. So when we think about dimensions, think about geometry. Think about geometric formulas in terms of what's possible from a spatial level. So if we in dimensions start with 0 point, so I just want to start all of these from 0 point because basically everything comes from nothing as a starting point. So the first thing that happens is we have what I call no dimensions. We have a single point. That is like a single thing and it has nothing else to interact with. We might think of this in terms of coming out of the nothing is the first idea that there is something. And so the something is this point. So then when we move on to one dimension, what happens is then we actually end up with 2 points. And those 2 points can then obviously be connected in some way. They can be connected by a line. So this is where we have a linear view. Our geometric formula is distance because the only thing that can occur between these points is distance. So that's one dimension. So when we look at second dimension, we add a third point. So I'll add a third point, and this is two-dimensional. So this is where whenever the 3 points interact with each other, however they interact, is you always end up with a surface, with something flat. And no matter where the points move, you're always going to have a flat surface or a flat area in terms of geometry. So now when we move into 3D, we add a fourth point. So we have our 3 existing points, but we have a third point. And as those points all interact with each other, we find out that we have what we now think of as a 3D spatial object. It has volume. So all of our geometric formulas in terms of volume apply to our 3-dimensional universe. So this is 3 dimensions, and now I just want to have a bit of an explanation about what the geometry is, because these shapes, the more you add points to them, you don't actually create a new dimension. All that happens is that the potentials of the 3-dimensional shape changes. So as an example, the more points you add, you tend to end up with a more spherical shape because all of the points get spread out. So as we add more and more points of geometry into 3 dimensions, we just end up with different shapes. Now, if we have a look at our 3-dimensional world and we think about shapes, basically what we end up with is geometries interacting with each other either as separate geometries or geometries within geometries, shapes within shapes. So as an example, let's say we've got, the shapes here of 3 different cells, but all of those cells live in the shape of an organ. And then of course we've got different organs, each with their own cells, and all of these organs live in a body. So this goes on and on ad infinitum, down to the smallest thing we can imagine to the biggest thing we can imagine is shapes and geometries within other shapes and geometries. So this is where it's really interesting, because the way that these are connected together is actually done through density, which is consciousness or awareness. These geometries are not actually bound together as a dimension, they're just there as geometric potential, if that makes sense. I know this, I don't know how much this is making sense to anyone, but I'm giving it a go. So now when we look at fourth dimension, this is where it gets interesting, because now we're adding the concept of time. So in time, basically what happens is that if you can imagine this group of geometries that have been connected through a particular form of, in a particular way, basically compose a moment in time. So when we take a snapshot of all of the geometries and shapes and how they're interacting with each other and how they are located in space, is you have a snapshot in time. And then what happens is, if you can imagine, in 4D, we have, more of these moments of time. These are all supposed to look like this, but you know what I mean. So in 4D time, we have these snapshots of potential. But the thing to understand here is that the connection between these moments of time is not actually set in the universe. It's provided through awareness, which we'll get to in a moment. But basically, these moments in time can be connected together in any way. Now, we happen to have these moments in time connected in a very linear fashion, where we're kind of saying, that there's this thing called a second and a millisecond and a minute, and these are connected together through those current concepts of time that we put onto these moments. So time in itself is just a construct. It's a geometric construct. It doesn't actually exist. And it's only when we connect all these moments together that we create the illusion of time. So that's fourth dimension. So now let's look at fifth dimension, and I'm not going to go past fifth dimension. But if you can imagine that in 4D, you have these moments of time stitched together. In 5D, what you have, and let's call that a timeline, right? In 5D, what you have is multiple timelines. So in 4D, you have this one timeline where you see a past and you see a future, but in 5D, you have multiple timelines. So, there's many possibilities of these moments stitched together and how they could be stitched together based on our input into them, I guess. Okay, so 5D, multiple timelines. So this is the way that I see dimensions. A lot of people talk about dimensions, there's spatial dimensions and spiritual dimensions, but I actually see them as all being the same thing, linked by geometry. And obviously the formulas to create these multiple timelines and how they're all stitched together is obviously extremely complex. Perhaps there's a physicist out there who's worked them out, I don't know. But anyway, I hope that you understand what I think of as dimensions. Okay, so let's get to densities. So you often hear, things referred to as first density, second density, and what they're kind of saying is that in this shift, we're moving from the third to the fifth dimension, and we're moving from the third to the fourth density. So I want to explain a little bit about what I think of densities. So once again, we're going to go back to the 0 point. Now, I want you to think of densities as the mental plane. We're thinking about ideas and concepts as opposed to space, if that makes sense. So we start at 0 point, and then the first thing is that we create, I'm just going to put this one density instead of 1D to make it different. So one density, we have a single point of focus, and then that point of focus focuses on depending on what dimension we're in, and we're in third dimension, but that point of focus can focus on one time moment. So one density can focus on one thing. So then, if we look at this as an example in our natural world, to try to draw an analogy, it would be a rock. A rock is just there. It has no concept of future, of past. It gets created, it gets destroyed, it gets eroded, and it's just a rock. It has no awareness, and it's just simply existing in that one moment of time, or that one moment of 4 dimension. So then what happens is we add a second point of focus or awareness. Now, when we add the second point of awareness, then we start to have the ability to see at the same time another moment in time. So it's still very limited. You can only kind of see in a very short span of things. But an example here would be what we call, the animal kingdom. So animals are extremely instinctual and they have little self-awareness. It's because all they can do is see limited moments, and the moments, for example, that they have then as part of their memory are linked to, say, survival. So when they react, they're not reacting out of anticipation of a future or remembrance of a past, but more that this snapshot of moment is good or bad, if that makes sense. So second density, very low self-awareness, operating primarily from instincts. So then what happens is we add another point of awareness. So in this point of awareness, I'm going to put it up here, and I'm going to call this third density. It could be a triangle, but I'm just going to put the arrow down so it makes sense. So in third density, we have another point of awareness that is looking at itself, which is basically where humans are, and that's what self-awareness is that we can watch ourselves on this timeline. We can sort of extrapolate a past and a future because we can see these points and we look down on them. We're looking down onto these moments that are connected together, if that makes sense. So third density is really where we are, and it's a place to get stuck, because if you think about it, if you only have one level of awareness above this timeline, all you see is this timeline playing out. So you think that this timeline is real and that's all there is, and there's no other possibility or potential. So it's very easy to think that what's happening on that timeline is the cause of everything that's happening on the timeline, which actually is not entirely correct. And it's not until you get to higher levels of awareness where you're looking down further that you can see that there's actually something much bigger going on. So the other thing I want to talk about in terms of density is choice. So in one density, first density, as an awareness, really you have no choice. You are just in the moment, and that is what is happening. And it's actually the same in second density. I'm going to write no choice, because even though you can see the past, like a little bit of the past, you don't have a choice. It's like everything's instinctual because there is only one timeline you can follow. But then what happens is once you get to third density, you actually start to see that generally you have two choices. So when you're looking down onto the timeline and you can see that you have choice on the timeline, you tend to see it as kind of like a fork in the road, where you move from one moment to one moment depending on the choice that you make. So it's a very linear in terms of choice. So now let's come back to talk about fourth density. I'm just going to rub this off to give myself a bit more room here. But in fourth density, so if you can imagine there's these little, timelines playing out for all these different individuals. And in third density, you're sitting above it looking down onto your little timeline. In fourth density, there's a greater, I'll put a line there to make that sense, but there's something at the top of that then looks down on those. So there's a greater awareness that there are multiple awarenesses below us. So in the sense of our own personal awareness, that can actually be other versions of ourselves. So we start to realize that there are other versions of ourselves on different timelines. So this is where we start to actually say, well, I don't just have two choices on this linear timeline. I actually have multiple choices. In fact, you could argue that I have infinite choices because I can now see all these other points. So where this was a linear kind of forking, branching path, this becomes more like, you're sitting in this moment, and you can see that there are infinite moments around you in terms of what you would choose. So this is fourth density. I'm not going to go above fourth density because I think this is really where it's headed at the moment. And then the other thing that I just wanted to talk about in terms of fourth density is when you have another awareness sitting on top of other awarenesses, is that those other awarenesses aren't necessarily yourself. They could be other souls. So when you look at the Law of One material that Ra has talked about, is that this is what might be likened to, say, a social memory complex. All these different points of awareness of different people, souls, all pulled together into one awareness. And so you can start to see how the whole concept of telepathy and group thinking comes in here in terms of fourth density. So from third density to fourth density, we stop really seeing ourselves as individuals and we start realizing that we are all one, because coming back to, you know, this sense of geometry here is that, yeah, you can look at the person as an individual, but there's always a larger geometry containing all the people, you know, whether it's a community or a planet. And then there's always a larger entity containing all the planets, you know, that's the solar system. So this is where we get to work out that actually we're not individuals, we're part of this amazing geometric construct. Okay, so I hope you're with me. So really, just to kind of summarize this before I move on to archetypes, is that if we look at where we are now, we're third density. We are one point of awareness that is looking at ourselves and what we're doing, and we are in 3D, 4D. So we are in this sense of space and linear time. And what is happening is we're moving into fourth density, which is that we have awareness of multiple versions of ourselves, our interconnectedness in a 5D world where we can realize there are multiple timelines and new potentials. So now we've got our awareness and we've got our geometry, and we have to bring in some data. So the data is, if you think about it, the numbers that feed the geometry to create the shapes. And there are building blocks to how this is all put together so that it creates new and novel shapes. If you look at evolution, there's a drive from nature to go from simple things to more complex and efficient things, you know, whether we see it in terms of the evolving of a species or the evolving of nature. Everything becomes more and more complex and more efficient. So there are archetypes that have started once again from the 0 point and are then building blocks for the dimensions that we can then perceive. So let's start with the basic archetypes. As an example, you know, right down the building blocks, we have things like atoms and elements. Atoms and elements are these basic things. It's like you take the atom, which is like a basic structure, and then, you know, you have different varieties of that through evolution. You've got neutrons and protons and electrons, and then they create different elements, you know, whether it's carbon or nitrogen or oxygen or hydrogen. And that's where you actually have the building blocks. And if we have a look at how that feeds back into our space and our densities, is that at a basic element, then we've just got, you know, the start after the Big Bang. What they said was all this kind of, you know, primal soup of potential. So here we've got potential. Then the next archetypes that I see that stem from here are what I call the elementals. Can't spell. So the elementals are earth, air, fire, and water. We take all of the elements and they combine together in specific ways to create the elementals. And then the elementals, if you have a look at how they feed back into particularly first density, is that we have things made from the earth, rocks, soil, mountains. We have things made from water, oceans, rivers, waterfalls. We have things made from air, obviously, and we have things made from fire. And all of those 4 elements work together and combine together to create what we might think of as our elemental kingdom, which is really first density. So then if we look on from the elementals, then we start adding in the archetypes of movement. And I think, I'm not sure of the exact term, but if we look in astrology, there's like the 3 cardinals. So there's 4 of them. And then, you know, there's these 3 cardinals in astrology, you know, fixed, mutable. I can't remember the other one, but there's one that's stagnant, one that's moving, and one that's very flexible to do both. So now we've got the elements of movement. So we've got water that moves. We've got water, you know, so water that moves, you know, through a river or a waterfall. We've got water that's stable. So that's ice, you know, it's frozen. Or we've got water that's mutable. You know, that's the ocean coming and going and moving. So you start adding this sense of movement and you start getting things happening. So that's where the earth, you know, starts creating itself and morphing and becoming, evolving in first and even in second density. So then it's really interesting, because then if you look at how the elementals and the cardinals combine, they basically combine to make our 12 astrological archetypes. So, you know, the combination of fire and water, fire and the mutable element, or the combination of air and the fixed element, make those 12 different star signs. And astrology, if you look at it, is really just basically saying there are these archetypes that we have in our creation, and those archetypes then become things that can apply to personality. So that's where our personalities come from. It's fascinating to think that it, you know, stems right back to elements and how that becomes the building blocks for something like a mental concept of a person. It's really incredible. And you know, we see these archetypes even flowing on further and becoming more and more complex and more diversified. And I'm going to put down here, you know, the 64 of the I Ching. Also, you'll see them in the gene keys, and you'll also see them as our DNA codons. This number 64 as an archetype seems really important, and it provides a further breakdown of these basic archetypes into, you know, more subtle forms, so that we can evolve in more and more complex ways. So yeah, there's a lot on here. So the way I kind of see it is that if you take these building blocks and you apply an awareness point, and then you use the geometry that's available in your particular universe, is that you end up with your perception and your form. And this is what we see around us, this is the world we see around us. And the really important point to take home here is that everybody sees something different. We have a collective view, but everyone's view is totally different. And that comes back to here, is that there are multiple realities existing all the time. And that's why we live in a multi-dimensional universe. So how exciting is it that we are stepping into our creative power? So the reason that we are becoming more creative is because as our awareness gets further and further away from this one single point, is that we get closer and closer to the original creator. So we get more and more creative power the more we move up that hierarchy. And the other really interesting thing is, you know, down here it's really dense and heavy because there's no choice, no possibility. But as we move up this density, is we become lighter, because the reason we become lighter is because there's more possibilities. When there's more possibilities, it has to be lighter, because, you know, you've got to have the geometry to be able to switch between those different potentials easily, based on your awareness and, I guess, your will. Well, I hope that all made sense. There's a lot of stuff here. So yeah, I just really wanted to pull those together. I've been brewing about these for a while in my mind, and then just thought, well, I might as well just give a video a go and see if I can pull it all together. But I really hope that that helps people understand in particular the differences between dimensions and density, because I think that there's a lot of I guess confusion over that and what that actually means, like from a logical level, and how all of that flows together to create this amazing reality that we're in, and how and why we get this creative ability to have influence and input into this reality that we're creating, which is all part of our role in coming back to be the creators that we are. And that is how we create a new human template, and that is how we create a new earth. And yeah, I hope you got something out of this. Thanks for watching.